today's webinar, A Policy Playbook on Nonproliferation Sanctions, hosted by the Washington, D.C. office of the Keough School of Global Affairs and the Kroc Institute at the University of Notre Dame and the Fourth Freedom Forum. My name is Linda Gerber, and I serve as the Chief Operating Officer of the Fourth Freedom Forum and a team member from the Sanctions and Security Research Project, and I'm a co-author of the report we're presenting today. On behalf of our team, it is my pleasure to welcome you. Thank you for joining us. The Sanctions and Security Research Project is a project of the Fourth Freedom Forum, a nonprofit organization based in Indiana, and the Kroc Institute and Keough School. For 3 decades, our team has focused on ways to improve UN sanctions and incentives, reduce nuclear dangers, and prevent violent extremism. The timeline on the slide shows some highlights of our work in connection with some key moments for sanctions policy. As you can see, over the past 30 years, our team has worked alongside other experts to help transform sanctions policy and practice. Although there is still more work to do, we have focused on reforming what was a blunt instrument into smarter sanctions that are more precise, deliberately reaching the intended target rather than harming innocent civilians. We are here today to discuss the ways in which the incoming Biden administration can rethink and retool the use of sanctions in dealing with North Korea and Iran in particular, and in general with our allies to maximize sanctions effectiveness without doing harm to innocent civilians. While we have found sanctions to be effective in some cases, as we indicate in our report, we are concerned that sanctions have become overused and misused, thereby exacerbating dangerous risks of renuclearization and weapons development. To reduce these unnecessary risks, we conclude that the US, working with the UN Security Council and allies, can and should take immediate action. We also recommend that an independent commission should be established to provide a clear roadmap going forward to turn the tide and re-engage with all parties to promote cooperation and a more responsible use of sanctions, and resuscitate arms control. Before I turn things over to our moderator, Maura Policelli, who is the Executive Director of the Keough School's Washington, D.C. office, I would like to acknowledge our other team members and authors of the report. Alistair Miller, President of the Fourth Freedom Forum, David Courtwright, Professor of the Practice Emeritus and Director of the Global Policy Initiative of the Keough School, and George Lopez, Reverend Theodore M. Hesburgh, Professor Emeritus of Peace Studies at the Kroc Institute. Their biographies and more information about the Sanctions and Security Research Project can be found at sanctionsandsecurity.org. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to turn things over to Maura.
Thank you, Linda, and good afternoon. I have the pleasure of introducing our very distinguished panel today. First, we will have Professor George Lopez. He's the Reverend Theodore Hesburgh, Professor Emeritus of Peace Studies at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the Keough School of Global Affairs. He is a leading expert on economic sanctions, peace building, and various peace-related issues. Among other esteemed positions, during his more than 30 years in this field, he has held senior positions at the U.S. Institute of Peace, the United Nations Panel of Experts for Monitoring and Implementing UN Sanctions on North Korea, and the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Also today, we are pleased to have Dr. Trita Parsi with us. He's an award-winning author and an expert on U.S.-Iranian relations, Iranian foreign politics, and the geopolitics of the Middle East. He's the co-founder and former president of the National Iranian American Council. He has followed Middle East politics through work in the field and extensive experience on Capitol Hill and at the United Nations. Also today, we are very fortunate to have Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins on our panel. She is the founder and executive director of the Women of Color Advancing Peace, Security, and Conflict Transformation, and she is chair of the Committee on Radioactive Sources Applications and Alternative Technologies of the National Academies of Sciences. From 2009 to 2017, she was an ambassador at the U.S. Department of State, serving in a few key roles, including coordinator for threat reduction programs in the Bureau of International Security and Nonproliferation, and U.S. representative to the G7 Global Partnership against the spread of weapons and materials of mass destruction. Today, we are also very fortunate to have two respondents to our panel, Hrair Balian, who's the director of the Conflict Resolution Program at the Carter Center. He has worked in the Balkans, Eastern Europe, and the independent states emerging from the former Soviet Union, the Middle East, and Africa, serving in intergovernmental organizations and non-governmental organizations. And in his work, he has focused on elections, human rights, and conflict resolution. And also we have Jason Bartlett. He's a research assistant for the Energy, Economics, and Security Program at the Center for New American Security. His work focuses on global proliferation finance networks and sanctions evasion tactics, with special emphasis on North Korea, Iran, and Venezuela. So obviously we have an amazing group here today to share their expertise, and I will turn things over now to Professor George Lopez.
Maura, thank you very much. I am delighted to be part of this panel and this event. Welcome to all of you who have joined us, a very large number of folks. We're very pleased with the attention this is getting. Thank you as well to my co-authors on the panel, Linda, for her great introduction to our 30-year history of cooperation, and also our panelists, Trita and Ambassador Jenkins. Thank you so much for weighing in on this report, as well as comments from Jason and Hrair. It'll be a very exciting session, I'm sure. My role in my brief remarks is to highlight, I think, not only the report, but also to use the sanctions that have failed against North Korea as a lens to why we come up with the kind of recommendations we do. At the outset, I want to say that this particular panel and shorter report on non-proliferation sanctions is part of a larger effort that we're engaged in probably over the next 2 years, in which we want to critically re-examine sanctions that have been placed and designations on counterterrorism, on human rights, and particularly on the humanitarian impact of sanctions. So I enjoyed very much a number of the questions that were sent in the chat as we were assembling the names of folks and people who are here this evening. We're going to address a number of those questions in future reports and panels. Today, I'm going to zero in particularly on the non-proliferation sanctions as a way to kick off our wider discussion. North Korea, I admit, I was one of the people that was willing to give the administration the benefit of the doubt. At the start of their administration, they talked about not only a rejiggering of the mechanism by which you deal with North Korea, but in particular to believe in high-level summit diplomacy between the leaders as forging the conditions of cooperation that would then set the stage for making progress in this. And we all know the history before that being a struggle to get to a particular point of serious discussion of denuclearization with North Korea. So I gave it the benefit of the doubt. But it was quickly clear to me that beyond the level of conceptualization and the made-for-TV summits for the meeting of the leaders, there was an absence of any serious consideration and implementation of what we learned not only from past cases of some success with North Korea, but also from the research and policy relevant findings in the field of the mix of sanctions and diplomacy. In fact, what happened here in this case is a decision to go to maximum pressure sanctions out of a belief that the more pain you can inflict on a target, the more political gains and concessions you can get. To the extent to which escalating sanctions have ever produced results within the context of nuclear non-proliferation work, it's been accompanied by creative, consistent diplomacy with some flexibility in the pressure that sanctions would bring. So we often say in the sanctions game, they're designed not only to enrage the target, but also to provide a path for critical engagement, particularly at the bargaining table, but in this case for nuclear nonproliferation, with an array of working groups from military to military exchanges, diplomatic exchanges, etc. What quickly emerged after the marvelous principles, I'd say, of the Singapore summit was very little follow-up of the kind of tough diplomacy, strong bargaining, and signal sending that would come on how to get relief from the sanctions for a path of minimal or quid pro quo kind of exchanges, so that when we come to the Hanoi summit, it falls apart very, very quickly. Rather than the maximum pressure sanctions and tough-minded diplomacy leading to concessions from North Korea, what the United States had actually done is we put ourselves in our own box with maximum pressure sanctions, with maximal demands and diplomacy. Any departure from that was read by this administration as a sign of weakness, and they'd get no concessions from North Korea. So we spend ourselves in a continual cycle of being locked into sanctions that didn't work and sanctions that could be endured by the North without effective diplomacy to move to the kinds of things that had worked before. The 1994 agreed framework obviously incorporated, along with the six-party talks of a decade later, a great deal of work with our regional allies. The notion that both Japan and South Korea were held at bay, why this high-level diplomacy was conducted and what we call love letter exchanges between the two leaders, didn't engage the parties in the region in ways that have produced success before. So not only was it failed diplomacy and tough bargaining and consistent communication with the North Koreans, there wasn't communication with those who would be most critical to making whatever sanctions were in place work, but also with being part of the leverage that comes with good regional cooperation. The worst case, of course, was with regard to China. How you run an effective sanctions and diplomacy program focused on North Korea while you're engaged in an escalating and punishing trade war with China seemed to escape the administration in their bargaining and their set of lack of vision of where to go with the sanctions. I think the ultimate dilemma occurred in late 2018 and throughout 2019, when what already was a bad relationship and a really arm's length condemnation of the Security Council in many other ways by the administration, when we did have short range nuclear missiles being tested by the North Koreans, there was no discussion within the administration of taking this to the Security Council as another violation that demanded global cooperation to condemn and to continue to try to constrain. So the moral of the story with the North Korea sanctions is a sad one, but clear, that's led us to some of the consistent principles that we think need to be articulated with non-proliferation sanctions. The first and most important is sanctions are a tool in a multiple toolbox of available mechanisms to the foreign policy elites, and particularly the head of the administration, in doing the business of non-proliferation progress. And they only are effective if they're seen as a tool in service of a wider vision, which has a set of midterm and long-term objectives, and understand that in addition to escalating pressure, rather than maximum pressure, the flip side of sanctions, which is incentives, has often provided some of the best breakthroughs with regard to nuclear proliferation. And so what at the end of the day was a very disappointing situation, shown, I think, most especially here by the parade we saw in October of the new potential weapon systems and clear documentation by our intelligence agencies that uranium development has continued to accelerate and probably fuel propellant as well. The breakdown after Hanoi tells us that quality sanctions alone cannot work. You have to merge these with diplomacies and a plan in which a wide variety of tools aim to attain the goals you have. Now, while the Biden administration faces some obstacles in what's been left it with North Korea, I admit to having some optimism, because the last 6 months especially has seen a number of scholars and policy people make proposals that may break this maximum pressure cycle and re-engage diplomacy. Frank Ullman, the United States Institute of Peace, and Ambassador Jo Yoon had a great article on the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists in the fall. Frank and myself have written a piece in War on the Rocks about the application of the old grid framework. And there's a meeting even this afternoon at the Quincy Institute about the regional framework in East Asia, which may emerge. So there's a lot of good ideas out there, but our contribution to this is that there are basic principles of sanctioned success in nuclear nonproliferation, which have to be maximized. One of them, and in part, is if you make a deal, it's very important that you keep it. And the failure of maximum pressure when the Trump administration went to cancel the Jcpoa has been apparent. And our good colleague Trita is going to comment on Iranian policy, so I won't go very far there. But we include this example in the report because it's not just the North Korea case. It accents in many ways the importance of multilateral sanctioning and multilateral diplomacy being key to the future of U.S. success. We also highlight in the report that the United States increase its commitment, it follow up the failures of this administration to re-engage with arms control negotiations with the Russians, and particularly the New START Treaty, and to be able to be in a position in which we can show those more difficult foes that we have to negotiate with, like a North Korea, that we are capable of not only pursuing treaties that are in our interest and theirs, but will actually keep treaties. So the engagement with a New START Treaty as a way to be the global forum for cooperation, engaging with North Korea and Iran for gradual denuclearization, and particularly with Iran in re-engaging in multilateral dynamics, are the important recommendations we make. As Linda noted earlier, we also feel very much that if we're going to call on diplomats in the United States in particular to get back to hard-nosed diplomacy, to apply the findings from 30 years of sanctions research to the new challenges we face across a number of areas, what we need to do as a research team is do much of the same. So we're calling for the creation of a new independent National Commission on Economic Statecraft to lead the way in pointing the direction in what the overhaul of U.S. sanctions policy would look like. And in doing so, what we're trying to do is build from the kinds of principles that we learned before when we were fortunate enough to be part of the creation of new humanitarian guidelines to constrain sanctions at their worst, and in the formation of the Smart Sanctions movement. We want to aim at the creation of a U.S. and then wider diplomatic consensus for how do we achieve policy objectives while protecting the civilian populations that are countries under sanction. We want to deal with the explosion in counterterrorism listing and the other ways in which I'd say a misuse of listing through Treasury and the State Department has complicated ways in which sanctions and diplomacy can work hand in hand. We want to engage in this discussion partners who are critical to the multilateral success, particularly the champions of just and fair sanctions, countries like Sweden, Switzerland, and Germany that we've had work with before, and particularly the UN Security Council. We're hopeful we can reverse some things that have been misused. We're very hopeful that engagement in this area can lead to an effective and maybe even less use of sanctions because of the effectiveness of creative diplomacy. Let me turn it over to Mara now for the rest of our program.
Thank you very much, George. You gave us the landscape and an overview of the paper in a nice, succinct way to highlight the different features of the paper. So now we'll take a deeper dive into some of the specific issues that you laid out for us. And we'll turn to Dr. Parsi. If you could please share your insights and expertise specifically on the issues facing the Biden administration with Iran.
Thank you so much. It's a tremendous pleasure to be here. Very much enjoy the report. I think its recommendations are quite excellent and much needed. Before I go into what Biden will face, I just want to say a couple of words about the sanctions prior, not just to Trump, but prior to Biden, but also prior to Trump in the case of Iran. I think the report puts out some very, very important considerations. I would add perhaps that we also have to think through carefully that there is an alternative cost to sanctions. Sanctions have oftentimes been presented as an alternative to war and something that is totally compatible with diplomacy. At times, sanctions actually are an alternative to diplomacy. There are opportunities to be able to progress diplomatically that at times sanctions actually hold back. That was definitely the case with Iran prior to the Obama administration completely shifting towards diplomacy, which they only did after they realized that the sanctions policy was not going to be effective enough. The Iranians were progressing with their response to sanctions, which was to aggressively move forward with their nuclear program so fast that the sanctions couldn't keep up, and that actually was better for the US to shift completely to diplomacy and let that be at the center of the policy, and then having sanctions as leverage rather than sanctions as something that would cause the Iranians to essentially capitulate from their red lines. Going forward, we have seen under Trump how the Trump administration essentially adopted a completely different perspective, a perspective in which they thought that the big mistake the Obama administration had committed was to lift the sanctions too early or move towards diplomacy too early. If they only had kept the sanctions on for 6 months, the Iranians would have capitulated and a better nuclear deal would have been able to be reached. There's really nothing to support that. And now we know with 4 years of maximum pressure in which the US essentially tries to completely crush the Iranian economy and then combines that with unrealistic, unattainable policy objectives, that even after 4 years of that, the Iranians have not budged an inch. And in fact, they have doubled down on the policies that are problematic, at least in the region. The Trump administration itself attests to that. And then on the nuclear front, they have not backed down an inch. So it's quite clear that that approach going forward, if the Biden administration wants to return to some form of maximum pressure, I wonder if the Trump administration may actually have essentially vaccinated Iranians or vaccinated Washington from the idea that sanctions will work, because I find it extremely unlikely that the Biden administration ever would be able to get the same degree of sanctions pain on Iran as Trump did. And the reason why they won't be able to is because Trump was obsessed with Iran. He was willing to sacrifice almost all other American interests in order to maximize pressure on Iran, which ultimately was really bad for the US because there's a lot of other interests that were sacrificed. Biden is far more responsible, and as a result is not going to obsess with Iran and is not going to be able to reach the same pain levels. And if he can't reach that same pain level, and Trump didn't even manage to get the Iranians to capitulate with that pain level, then I think that may hopefully get Washington to realize that a policy that is centered on sanctions is not going to be successful. A policy that is centered on diplomacy and uses sanctions intelligently, as the report advocates, I think has a much greater chance of success. Because the coercive element is not at the center of it. And what the Biden administration is faced with right now is an effort by the Trump administration and other opponents of the Jcpoa, which incidentally are very few. We're talking about roughly 3 countries that oppose the Jcpoa, whereas the rest of the international community enthusiastically supported it. And that is Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. And the events of the last couple of months in particular seem to have been geared towards making sure that Biden's ability to re-enter the Jcpoa is minimized and essentially blocked. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel has made it completely clear that this is his agenda, that he is going to try to prevent Biden from going back. I think the assassination of the Iranian scientist Mohsen Fakhrizadeh about 2 months or so ago now clearly was motivated far more by a desire of creating a crisis that would make it more difficult for Jcpoa negotiations to restart than to believe that it actually had any profound impact on the trajectory of Iran's nuclear program. Israel has already assassinated 5 or 6 Iranian scientists, and none of those assassinations had any particular impact on the broader trajectory of the nuclear program. In fact, the only impact they did have, and the timing of it also suggests, seems to have been to make diplomacy more difficult. the fact that Netanyahu went forward with this months before or weeks before Biden comes in at a time when it was clear that Biden was going to be the president of the United States, I think is a rather ominous sign of how belligerent Netanyahu likely is going to be against Biden on this specific issue. And this specific issue has topped US-Israeli relations for the last decade or so. So it means that it's going to be most likely a rather contentious relationship, perhaps even more so than Netanyahu's relationship with Obama. Moreover, we've seen these other steps that have been taking place, such as the accusations, unfounded so far, that Iran has now become the hub for Al-Qaeda in the Middle East, something that no expert that I know attests to, as well as the putting the Houthis on the terrorist list. The main effect, and presumably the desire of these measures, is to just create as many political obstacles as possible in order to be able to prevent diplomacy from taking place. And I think that behooves then the Biden administration, as they come in, to not be particularly timid when it comes to reversing some of these decisions, because these decisions, A, counter US national interests, and B, were designed to render diplomacy impossible. And I think if they commit what I consider to be a mistake by the Obama administration to not be more forceful in reversing some of the policies of the Bush administration, then the Biden administration is going to end up in a scenario, in a landscape that frankly has been designed for it not to be able to be successful with its policy priorities. If I can just say a couple of short words as well about where I think things are heading with the Biden administration and Iran. I think it is extremely positive to see that the Biden administration has clearly signaled that their approach to the JCPOA is to do a quick re-entry based on compliance for compliance, meaning the United States goes back into its responsibilities fully, granted that, of course, the Iranians do the same. The Iranian reductions of their obligations is relatively easily reversible. The US side can also do this effectively, quickly. The only challenge is that sanctions relief on the American side has rarely been particularly effective, so that may cost some time. But nevertheless, the fact that they have decided to do this is essential, because it meant that it was a rejection of the idea that the sanctions that Trump has imposed constitute leverage that Biden would use for a new negotiation. If Biden had adopted that position, his position would essentially have been the same, at least nominally, as that of the Trump administration, which means that it would be okay to violate an agreement, impose sanctions, and that would be considered legitimate leverage, and that the deal should be renegotiated, which is again what Trump nominally said that he wanted to do. If Biden had gone down that path, I suspect that the Iranians very quickly would have walked out of the JCPOA and started exactly what they did during the sanctions year of the Obama administration, which was to build their own leverage. The main way they built their leverage was to advance the nuclear program very aggressively. Thankfully, that is not the path that the Biden administration seems likely to go down. Instead, they're seeking to have a quick re-entry, lift these sanctions, and then once inside of the deal, once complying with the deal, return to negotiations in order to have add-on agreements that would expand the nuclear program, but also start and the nuclear agreement, but also address regional issues that are contentious in the region. This is essential because it puts the United States in a much better standing. It would be a country that is respecting its obligations before it tries to renegotiate, but also because it's designed to make sure that the JCPOA is not held hostage to these other negotiations, meaning if those other negotiations fail, or some of them fail, that would not then cause the JCPOA to collapse. The JCPOA stands, it's the floor, it's the foundation. If other things can be added to it, then that's very positive. If it can't, it nevertheless would not jeopardize the continuous existence of the JCPOA. I think that is a much cleverer and much more likely approach to succeed. That is what I believe the Biden administration is going to try to do, but it is going to face tremendous obstacles, some from the Republicans internally here in the United States, but most of them coming from primarily the Israeli Prime Minister, as well as the leaders of Saudi Arabia and the UAE. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Parsi. I also want to make sure, because I don't think I included it when I introduced Dr. Parsi, but he's the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. So those of you watching who want to see other works of Dr. Parsi, I just want to make sure you know that affiliation. I also want to remind folks that if you have any questions that you want our panelists to respond to shortly during our, when we turn to Q&A, please put those in the Q&A box on the lower part of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. Let's turn now to Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins. So having taken a look at North Korea and Iran, let's shift to Russia. And if you could share your thoughts on New START, I guess just to refresh everyone's recollection about its, its purpose and how it's been functioning over the years, and if you think there's any chance of it being put back on track by the Biden administration. We'd love for you to at least start with that, if you will, and offer any other comments based on the discussion so far.
Great, thank you, and thank you for inviting me. I am in an office where the lights like to go off by themselves, so I hope they don't. I hope they don't do that while I'm speaking. Before I start, I want to put everything into a little bit of context, and I think one thing that we need to think about, in addition to what you've been hearing about the JCPOA, what's been going on in North Korea, is that we have been watching how the U.S. really has been stepping away from the traditional leadership role that we have had on issues of nonproliferation and disarmament that we've enjoyed for many years. And I think what you're hearing today is an example of that, looking at, the fact that we had, made some, or at least looked like we were making positive steps with North Korea. And as been noted, the steps weren't really serious because we weren't really taking the time to do the real work to make sure that those talks could actually be successful in the long run. Then you heard about the JCPOA, of course, and of course withdrawing from the JCPOA was really a big step backwards in many respects, because it really was an agreement, as you heard, that was really doing what it was supposed to do, and really was not, something that there was a real violation, and then we stepped back from that, and that has created a whole bunch of problems that you've heard. And then we've done a number of other things, like we have withdrawn from the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which is a treaty that, as you know, was between Gorbachev and Reagan, that had eliminated a whole class of medium-range missiles, and we have done a number of things. So it's in this context that we are talking about all these things, including New START, and looking at the future as we look toward a Nonproliferation Review Conference, which is going to take place in August, if it's not moved again. And what do we say that we have done as a country as we approach that conference, where we're going to be looked upon and say, and the countries are going to look to us and say, well, we know that what's been going on, we see what's happened. Are we going to be able to make steps toward the JCPOA? Are we going to be able to make some steps toward some kind of negotiations, opening some kind of exchange with North Korea, in addition to a number of things that have happened in this whole framework in which the U.S. has been seen as stepping backwards. There's also, many of you may know about the Open Skies Treaty, which is a treaty that, that we have had with our allies and with Russia and other countries in Europe that we have also withdrawn from recently. So that's the context in which we're talking about. And that's the context in which the Biden administration is entering into this field. And you have this date of August where we will be with a lot of countries really looking and saying, and really asking what we're doing. So here you have the START Treaty, which from 2011, and really it's the last treaty that we have, bilateral treaty that we have with Russia on arms control issues. And as you might know, and I'll say a little bit more about what the limitations, but it's we have had a series of START treaties with Russia. And, the idea when we did this latest treaty in 2011 was that there would be another one, and that we would continue to have these agreements with Russia that the main goal is to reduce nuclear weapons, reduce missiles. And that's one way in which we are abiding by our obligations in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is to reduce our nuclear weapons, reduce our missiles, to give the impression that no, we're not going to go to zero tomorrow, but we're making the steps and making the efforts to actually get there. And so, you have the START Treaty, which was entered into force in February 2011, and the requirements, and these requirements are, each time we have a new START Treaty, they put in more numbers. So the two countries, Russia and the US, are limited to, for example, 700 deployed intercontinental ballistic missiles, 1,550 nuclear warheads are deployed, intercontinental ballistic missiles, 800 deployed and non-deployed ICBM launchers, and a number of other limitations, which both countries are abiding by. They both met their limits in 2018. So this is another example of a successful treaty. In the treaty itself, it has a 5-year automatic extension if the two countries agree to it. And it says that the treaty will expire in 2021, in February of 2021, which is next year, unless the two sides agree to extend it. So the question has been for the past 4 years, and the pressure, the question and the pressure is to extend the treaty, because once the treaty ends, it lapses, of course. There is no anymore any treaty with Russia on arms control issues. And if we want to do another treaty, we have to go back to the Senate. And that's key, is that if we want to extend this treaty, the two sides can sit down and do so. We do not have to go back to the Senate for another treaty. And that is really key because it's been very difficult to get the Senate to agree to arms control treaties. It was very difficult to get them to agree to this one. And so that's why it's been such a big issue. Unfortunately, it has not really gone far because the Trump administration really did waste a lot of time not actually doing that. The Russians have been very forthcoming that they do want to have a 5-year extension of this treaty. They do want to extend the treaty. The U.S., unfortunately, and most of you probably know just from reading the news, has not really taken up Russians on that. We have wanted to bring China into these negotiations, and that has brought in an extra wrinkle into these discussions with Russia on extension, because Russia is not really looking at pressuring China to join, even though the US would like Russia to do that. In addition to that, Russia has also said, well, if you're gonna bring China in, then you should bring everyone in, which would be France and the UK, which they're not all that keen to get into this treaty either. So essentially the easiest thing would be to extend the treaty. There were some conversations toward the end of last year, an effort by the Trump administration to kind of speed this up a bit. And so there was a discussion of maybe extending for 1 year, putting a freeze on nuclear warheads. That went back and forth a couple times, but suffice it to say that on January 13th, 2021, there is no extended treaty. And unless the Trump administration does one in a week, it won't be extended. So therefore, obviously, this is going to be one of the things that the next administration will have to look at, is the extension of this treaty, not only because it's the last treaty, not only because if we lose a treaty, we lose our on-site inspections that we do in Russia. Not only that, but we'll have to, if we want another treaty, we'll have to go back to the Senate. Not only that, because if we don't have one, we will have to go to the Nonproliferation Treaty Review Conference, basically saying we have not done what we could have done in 5 years and in all these years to extend this treaty. So that's where we are with that. And just to say, this is part of a larger issue that we're having right now in the area of nonproliferation, in the area of arms control, the role that the U.S. has been playing, which has not been its traditional role. And it's a role that hopefully we will be able to take up by doing these issues, by taking up Jcpoa, by looking at North Korea. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Jenkins. Let's shift now to get some initial feedback to our panelists and all that they've offered us so far, which has been incredibly rich perspectives. And so we'll turn first to Hrair Balian, the director of the Conflict Resolution Program at the Carter Center. If you could share a little bit about the additional work on sanction reform initiatives that you may be undertaking at the Carter Center, and any reflections or responses to our panelists.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this very timely and important event. And more importantly, thank you so much for the paper you've published, which is more than timely, extremely important, and extremely very much needed to affect a course correction from as various experts have characterized, from sanctions madness to financial carpet bombing to war by other means that we've been seeing for the past years and years, and not just limited to the Trump administration, I'm afraid, but it dates back to many more administrations before then, where sanctions have been, there has been an over-reliance on sanctions, even abuse on sanctions. But of course, the last 4 years, we've seen sanctions put on steroids, basically under the Trump administration. Your research and paper and the discussion today is limited to non-proliferation issues. But I think someone mentioned that it is equally applicable. What you're advocating is equally applicable to sanctions in other foreign policy areas of change, ranging from change of regime behavior to reforms, advocating reforms, etc. We have, I mean, in places like from Russia, Syria, Venezuela, Cuba, etc., where the sanctions policies to date have been really unsuccessful. Not much, if anything, has changed in the behavior of those countries and their leadership. Let's not forget also that as we speak today, unilateral sanctions and export controls have been imposed by the US on 48 countries representing 1/3 of humanity. That's an enormous number. That's a really huge number that we cannot forget. So your paper and what you're advocating, the Independent National Commission on Economic Statecraft, is very, very much welcome and timely and extremely important, in particular taking into account the 3 recommendations that you have been advancing, to rely more on multilateral sanctions so that sanctions instrument cannot be abused by a single country as it is today, to emphasize inducement rather than punishment. The use of sanctions as a punishment tool is extremely important. And most importantly, to avoid the use of, to avoid sanctions doing huge humanitarian, huge damage to innocent populations, as we've seen in the case of Iran, Syria, and Venezuela, and many other countries, in particular during the time of COVID-19 and other pandemics. So it's really an important work that you're doing. We welcome it at the Carter Center. At the Carter Center, we've been working on sanctions only for the last 2-3 years, focusing on Syria and the policy that the US and European Union have been advancing on trying to advance change in Syria. What the US and the EU have been doing in the case of Syria has been punishing rather than inducing a change. We published just yesterday a paper, our 4th paper on sanctions policy on Syria, which I'll just put a link on the chat after my comments in a minute. And even the punitive approach to sanctions has just not worked. It has changed absolutely nothing in the behavior. The sanctions policy in Syria has been a continuation of the war that the West and the regional powers declared on Syria back in 2011 following the uprising, and it has failed. And the sanctions policy following this war, which has continued the war by other means, has equally failed to affect any change in the behavior of the regime. And it is time to change, to switch, to pivot to a policy of perhaps using sanctions as a diplomatic tool to induce change in Syria. In other words, to gradually adjust and lift sanctions on Syria in exchange for verified positive steps by the Syrian regime. Easier said than done, I admit, but the alternative is a failed state in the case of Syria. So we would welcome any collaboration in this field with you and your team at the Keough School. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hrair. And just to let folks know, the Carter Center website is cartercenter.org. Since the chat is not available to all participants, we won't be able to send you the link in that way, but you can go to the Carter Center website to find the publication on Syria that Hrair was just mentioning. So lastly, let's turn to Jason Bartlett with the Center for New American Security for some final reflections or insights on the discussion thus far.
Great, thank you. First, I would like to thank the authors for writing this very important and relevant report, just to echo what Hrair said. The issues covered in this report actually correlate to a number of research fields we also cover at CNAS, primarily U.S. course of economic statecraft and sanctions implementations. Last year, we launched our Sanctioned by the Numbers project, which quantifies and categorizes U.S. sanctions and delistings with specific focus on China, Iran, Russia, and North Korea. In recent months, we've published reports on a 2021 counterproliferation finance strategy, North Korea's cyber-enabled financial crime and sanction evasions, and the use of export controls on Chinese markets. This past December, we published a CNAS task force report paper on America's use of coercive economic statecraft, in which we argue that Congress and policymakers in the upcoming Biden administration should apply equal resources and effort to developing positive economic statecraft to achieving their policy goals, such as domestic economic renewal and international development incentives. And so I was very glad to see this positive language also included in the Keough School report, as there tends to be focus on only the punitive powers of US economic measures. I believe the authors did a great job in the report of outlining how sanctions can be used as an integral tool of foreign policy, but should never be the core of policy itself. The Trump administration's failed maximum pressure campaign indicates how sustained unilateral sanctions as a primary tool for coercion does not work, and in fact can exacerbate not only hostile political tensions, but also global mistrust of America's diplomatic judgment, as well as humanitarian crises abroad, specifically seen in Iran and Venezuela. Another important point to include is that these harsh unilateral US sanctions have also pushed North Korea, Iran, and Venezuela deeper into not only the orbits of China and Russia, but also the orbits of each other, which goes against the entire narrative behind the Trump administration's maximum pressure sanctions campaign. In terms of North Korea, I think it'll be extremely difficult to persuade the Kim regime to relinquish all nuclear weapons, regardless of whether the US pursues continued maximum pressure or attempts to engage with Pyongyang. Nuclear development has become so deeply entrenched within North Korea's economic and political identity and continues to be viewed as the ultimate security insurance against the United States. As Kim Jong-un himself recently mentioned in his Party Congress address and the October 10th military parade, he has not been successful in revitalizing the North Korean economy, and his only domestic achievement to date is expanding the country's nuclear arsenal. Therefore, this is not something he will most likely ever fully relinquish until the possession of nuclear weapons no longer plays to his leadership narrative. However, I do believe that the authors accurately illustrated how a maximum pressure campaign only helps to legitimize the belief that heavily sanctioned nations must have nuclear weapons to defend themselves against the United States. And I agree that it would be in the Biden administration's best interest to change this assumption. More specifically, the lack of coordination between Washington and Seoul for the past 5 years on North Korea allowed ample opportunity for the Kim regime to engage in diplomatic discourse while also further expanding its ballistic and nuclear arsenal. This demonstrated how both US and South Korean policy towards North Korea is most effective when they act in concert. So I agree with the authors in that there needs to be a multilateral sanctions policy and peace process for North Korea, along with allies, in order to achieve any true lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula. And lastly, although the United States won't be able to fully decouple China nor Russia from North Korea, offering evidence-based sanctions relief or a sunset clause in future multilateral sanctions can be a viable option to reduce Pyongyang's total reliance on Beijing and Moscow. As a result, this could create positive leverage for Washington to use in future negotiations or peace talks with North Korea. However, given the current Moon administration's position on North Korea, any hardline US efforts against Pyongyang, especially in regards to human rights abuses, will most likely fall flat of strong South Korean governmental support. So the US's first step should be reaffirming its leadership role in the region and recreating a multilateral sanctions and peace policy approach alongside South Korea. This will require considerable compromise on both sides, and I believe that the authors of this report beautifully laid out the framework for what that could look like in that type of scenario.
Great, thank you, Jason. So we have time to hopefully get through some of the fantastic questions that have come in. Some of you submitted questions when you registered, and some of you have given us questions during this session so far. We will try to get through as many as possible with our panelists probably speaking at double speed, just so we can try to get through them. So I'm going to lump these together as best I can to be efficient. And I have a few to send to you, Professor Lopez, to kick off this Q&A part of our discussion today. So first, if you could say a few words about the sanctions imposed on Venezuela, again, broadening our conversation to sanctions beyond just nonproliferation. That's a question that came in during the registration period. And then also, I'll toss you a question that came in during this event about North Korea and how much US bandwidth there is to sanction North Korea's mainland Chinese enablers. So if you could tackle those two, that would be great. And then I'll toss some other questions to other panelists.
Thank you so much, Maura, and thank you, audience, for these questions. I think the Venezuela case is a classic example of the failure of unilateral sanctions, and also an unrealistic positing of a sanctions goal to be attained with simply a massive trade embargo and another case of maximum pressure. You know, sanctions historically have never toppled the regime. So the notion of sanctions as a regime-changing tool, or even the notion as part of a bag of tricks to overthrow a regime, it's got a very, very zero track record. Sanctions are effective in persuading change in leaders that are there, and the confused goals of regime change or resignation of Maduro was really so confusing that it didn't have any chance of success. But the maximum pressure sanctions there also were devastating of the worst kind, as Hrair pointed out, with regard to humanitarian impact and impact on civilians themselves. The State Department had said a number of times that it had created a mechanism by which humanitarian organizations could get food and medical supplies through, that there was nothing in the maximum pressure sanctions that was constraining the ability of average Venezuelans to get medicine off the shelf. If there were inefficiencies there, it was the problem of the Maduro administration. But if you look closely and dealt at all with humanitarian organizations that were engaged in this, it was quite the opposite. Worse yet, the kind of secondary sanctions that were imposed on a number of our European allies for dealing with Venezuela wound up trapping legitimate Venezuelan money from legitimate sales prior to the imposition of sanctions from coming back to the central bank, which they could have used for contracts to buy medical supplies and the like. If people want to email me, a good co-author and I have a paper on articulating some of this and some of the difficulties. Very good question on China. If you look at the pattern of the last 18 months in particular of Treasury sanctions, Treasury's really gone after so-called enablers within China of two types. Certainly corporations and government elites tied very, very closely to the government of China and in its exchanges with North Korea, but also individuals who've been mobilized by the North Koreans who happen to work and live in China and have a shared business interest in either a shadow company or in semi-legitimate exchange, but probably of goods that violate the trade restrictions of the sanctions. So you have to ask the question, if you're an incoming administration, how can I possibly deal with the sanctions busters that are present in other countries, particularly China, without a clear cooperative relationship with that government where these people exist, and also without a clear articulation of what sanctions violations are really important for restricting what we want to have happen in North Korea or not. And so I attribute the either inefficiencies, if that's what the questioner meant, of getting the sanctions right on real enablers in China, or as I would see it, the massive burst in the number of Chinese individuals and companies that are being sanctioned as an indication of the failure of a Chinese-US relationship to understand it being in China's interest to cooperate. And again, the poorest exploitation of the sanctions by North Korea because maximum pressure effectively didn't work.
Great, thank you, George. I'm going to shift to Ambassador Jenkins. There's a handful of questions, both that were submitted in advance and have come up that get at the issue of U.S. credibility. In particular, in this realm, obviously, we're talking about U.S. core values and our ability to play a role of sanctioning other countries and actors. So Ambassador Jenkins, if you could reflect on that a little bit in terms of how the world might see the U.S. at this moment and in the context of sanctions, is there such a thing as ethical sanctions or sanctions that really express core values of the United States? Is that something that we can even credibly posit that that ethical sanctions are something that the U.S. can promote with any credibility?
Yes, I mean, I think right now we have a credibility problem, generally speaking. I mean, this is something that we've been having for a while, for the past few years, and it hasn't helped what's happened in the last week or so. So we have we need to understand that we need to get a sense of what is the perception of the U.S. right now. And what is our role right now? And I think that we do have a credibility problem that I think we can overcome. I don't think it's impossible. I think that it's possible for countries to again see the U.S. in many of the same lights that we have been seeing before. So I think there is a possibility of that. I don't think all is lost in terms of any credibility that we might have lost in the past few years. And I think that also, I mean, the way in which we do sanctions, I think it can also reflect that. I think that if we do sanctions like we do anything else in a way that is, seen as, tailored and direct and not really hitting issues and things that are not really in line with what we really want to achieve. I think that we should see sanctions. I think that we should see everything that we're doing in our toolbox as ways in which we can try to improve our credibility that we have taken such huge steps back from in the past few years. So this to me should be seen not in isolation in terms of what the U.S. needs to do in the future. I think this should be part of how do we want to be in the future? How do we want people to see us? What role do we want to play in light of the fact that, in many respects, we've taken steps backwards, and sanctions are a part of that.
And just one quick follow-up, as a questioner, someone just submitted it as a question. In terms of the US and our own nuclear arsenal, and the world community possibly a little bit more concerned than previously about, at least in theory, sanctioning the US in some way, or being able to put pressure on the US to, decrease its arsenal. So on the nonproliferation front, do you anticipate that kind of pressure on the Biden administration for the U.S. to decrease its arsenal?
I think there's always been pressure on the U.S. to decrease its arsenal. I think that we've been able to step aside from that by doing things like the START Treaty, engaging in many ways in which we're trying to show the importance of nonproliferation and arms control and disarmament. So we've done it in many ways, and we've shown, and we've been doing is showing by having treaties, many of which we're getting out of, but having treaty that show that we are serious about it and that we are actually doing, walking the walk and talking the talk, which you have to actually do it yourself. So when we do things like, not extend the New START Treaty, when we do things like think about new types of nuclear weapons or putting weapons on different types of ships and submarines, and talk about potential nuclear testing again, and all of those things are negative in terms of our claim that we're actually trying to be live up to our arms control obligations that we have in Non-Proliferation Treaty and other things. So this goes back to, as I was saying, the perception of the U.S., which is that we are not doing what we said we were going to do, and we're actually doing more things by saying we're going to be building new types of nuclear weapons, things like that. Whether we'll get to sanctions part, I wouldn't say that right now anyone's going to try to sanction the U.S., and I think that we could probably get a little bit of ourselves back in order before then, but certainly the pressure will remain. And the Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conferences are not always fun events for the U.S., and I don't think that it will be necessarily a fun one in August if we don't do something before then.
Yep, thank you. Dr. Trita, turning back to Iran and picking up on the theme of ethical sanctions, we have a question about what kind of targeted sanctions there might be in Iran that are not as harmful to the civilian population. If you could discuss that. And then there's also a question about Afghanistan and with troops withdrawing, how the U.S. should possibly have some leverage in Afghanistan. If you could take those two, that would be great.
Sure. Thank you so much. Well, I think, first of all, we have to keep one thing in mind here. The type of sanctions that are currently posed on Iran are massive, comprehensive, and as untargeted as possible. When you have sanctions that target a country's financial institutions and essentially makes all financial transactions with that country illegal, at least from a standpoint of US law, it means that even though you may not have sanctions on medicine and food, those things are nevertheless sanctioned, because when you sanction financial transactions, you sanction everything. So if one were to now add on to this human rights targeted sanctions, for instance, it wouldn't change the larger picture, because the larger picture is still such that the sanctions regime as a whole is impacting the population far more so than impacting the decision makers and the politicians in that country. So if we actually want to move to a situation in which we, for instance, could have targeted human rights sanctions to make sure that the pressure is put on the specific officials that are responsible for human rights abuses, that is something I think can be done, but only in a context in which that is the center of our sanctions. It is not something that is added on to completely comprehensive and blunt sanctions that target the entire population. So if we want to move in that direction, we have to first undo a lot of these really damaging sanctions that, in my view, are human rights violations in and of themselves, because it is collective punishment, particularly on a population that do not have the same type of abilities to impact the policies of their government as exists in other countries that are more proper democracies. When it comes to Afghanistan, if I understood the question correctly, I would be careful not to believe that the real leverage the United States has in the Afghan arena right now is because it has 2,500 troops. The leverage the United States actually can have in Afghanistan and moving and helping the Afghans themselves move the inter-Afghan conversations forward and reach some sort of a political settlement is through the incentives it can provide to the Afghan parties for reaching such an objective, rather than thinking that the 2,500 troops are actually the core of the US's leverage. In fact, in many ways, the 2,500 troops are just targets at this point. They're not in a position to really do that much, but they are certainly in a position to be targeted by the belligerence that is taking place in that country. I think after 19 years of military activities in Afghanistan, in which we've been constantly been told by the military, and now we know from the revelations of last year that was all lies and there were deliberate lies, that we're just 3 months away from turning the corner, etc. We really have to walk away from the idea that military assets is what truly constitutes American leverage in situations like this.
Thank you, Trita. And just to clarify on that, I think the concern of the questioner here is about how to make sure that Russia doesn't creep back into Afghanistan with the U.S. withdrawal. But I also just want to keep you on the hot seat for a moment with a question related to Saudi Arabia. The question is, looking forward, states of proliferation concern include U.S. partners and allies. How would a sanction strategy be retooled to address proliferation risks in states with strong U.S. ties, such as Saudi Arabia?
Thank you, and thank you for clarifying. I had clearly misunderstood the question a little bit. I think what the United States should do in Afghanistan is to help internationalize the diplomatic efforts to be able to reach an agreement. There clearly is an interest in Russia and other countries, Iran, India, Pakistan, to be able to be part of it. And I would also be a little bit hesitant of the view that, the Russians are just eager to get back into Afghanistan. I really don't think there's a lot of countries that think that being in Afghanistan is some sort of a benefit to their own national interest. But I do believe in order to minimize whatever small risk there is to help put together an international effort in order to ensure that the fragility of the inter-Afghan political process does not become an arena for outside countries to try to use for their own purposes to advance their own interests. That's the real risk we have to worry about. And I think there actually is an appetite for that within those countries that I mentioned. In regards to Saudi Arabia and how to deal with proliferation risks there, I'm not so sure if necessarily we have to go down the sanctions path when it comes to Saudi Arabia on this specific issue that quickly. At the end of the day, the United States actually has a tremendous amount of leverage over Saudi Arabia. What we're having a lack of is a willingness to use that leverage. The United States can quite easily end the war in Yemen by simply refusing to provide the assistance to the Saudis that the US military currently is providing, both under Obama and even more so under Trump. So we have a tremendous amount of leverage. We do not have to go down the path of economic sanctions necessarily in order to be able to prevent those things. What the core of the problem is that the influence of some of these countries in Washington has helped create a scenario in which it's very difficult to muster the political will to be able to use the leverage that the United States has vis-a-vis Saudi Arabia, for instance. And much of that is because so much of how the Saudis buy their influence in Washington is by buying American weaponry, which then gets the defense industry on their side and is essentially the real pro-Saudi lobby in the United States. That's where the issue is. It's not necessarily as to whether we need to retool sanctions in a different way to be able to have an impact on the Saudis. We have plenty of leverage over the Saudis. We don't need sanctions for that. It's just that we're lacking the political will to use it.
Thank you so much, Trita. And I know we're close to the end, but I want to toss a question out there for any of you to grab. And this is on a question related to religious extremism as a threat separate from nuclear weapons per se. And relatedly, or tangentially, but in that same realm, the U.S. use of designating organizations as foreign terrorist organizations, as the Secretary of State Pompeo just announced for the Houthis. So just that's a big topic to toss out, but does anyone want to respond to that element of U.S. sanction policy?
I'll be happy.
Go ahead.
No, please.
Trita, you take first shot.
Okay, thank you, George. Yeah, I think what we're seeing here is really a tremendous, a trend that already has existed, I would have to say, but it's been highly accelerated in the last couple of years because of the way that the Trump administration has addressed this, and that is how the United States actually uses the terrorist list, the criteria for getting on, the criteria for getting off. It already started earlier on. I mean, it was actually unfortunately under the Obama administration that an Iranian terrorist organization, the Mujahideen Khalq, launched what essentially must have been an illegal lobbying campaign in Washington that lasted more than 2 years. Illegal because not that they don't have a right to legally challenge their inclusion into the terrorist list. They absolutely do. What they don't have a right to do is to buy lobbyists and provide a lot of financial compensation to Washington profiles for them to come out and become their spokespeople. Al-Qaeda could not do this. ISIS cannot do this. There's no reason why the Mujahideen and Khalq should have been able to do this. And that was partly because of a politicization of this issue in which there was a degree of benign neglect from the administration side. But now we've seen that even become much more blatant than in the past. We saw that, for instance, in order for the Sudanese to be able to get out of the terrorist list, they had to normalize relations with Israel. What has that got to do as to whether they truly should be on the list or should not be on the list? We see now that Pompeo is adding the Houthis to the list, and we've seen an outcry from humanitarian organizations who are saying that this will make the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, which already the United States is unfortunately partly responsible for, even worse. We've seen the Europeans come out and also reject this, pointing out that this will make it much more difficult to find a political settlement in Yemen, which I think a lot of actors have been somewhat optimistic could happen once the Biden administration comes in, mindful of his promises to end the war and push forward on this issue. So again, we're seeing how the terrorist list, sanctions, and other things are being used by the Trump administration for their own political calculations, in this specific case, in order to make it more difficult for the Biden administration to undo some of this damage that they've caused and move forward towards a more peaceful path for the region through political settlements. This is highly problematic because it ultimately really devalues the standing of the U.S. as terrorist list.
Final word, George, and then Ambassador Jenkins also, if you want to offer any final word before we wrap up.
I agree completely with Trita. I guess the final word is the panel shows us in many ways the explorations that need to be done from those of us in the analyst community to try to be helpful for refining the practices in creating sanctions and the reason for their use, the fine-tuning with diplomacy, but also this kind of re-examination that we'd like to take in our project of what happens when you list this many people and who really pays the price. It's the innocent people on the ground, but also, as Trita noticed, the humanitarian organizations that are designed to help those people on the ground who face the tremendous roadblocks in doing that.
Ambassador Jenkins, final word.
I think the only thing I would add is, I think, and this was raised earlier, I think George says it earlier, that we need to look at sanctions as part of a tool, as part of a number of tools. And we need to see how it fits into other things that we're trying to do and what we're trying to achieve. And I also think that we have to, and Trita mentioned this very well, how we have to be very selective and know exactly what we're trying to target and not try to do too much with sanctions. I think too often we've used it to do too many things, and they're not really targeted enough, and they're having ramifications that are not really going to help in the long run. So I think, I think those are two things that I think would be helpful as we go forward. So thanks.
Great. Thank you all for being here. I know that this effort will continue, the partnership with the Fourth Freedom Forum and and the Keough School at Notre Dame. So stay tuned for more to come in promoting the recommendations from the report that was released. A recording of this discussion will be sent around to all of you tomorrow, also with a link to the paper if you hadn't read it already. Thank you so much to our distinguished panelists. Really appreciate your time and your thoughtfulness on these critical issues facing the incoming administration and the world right now. Have a good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being with us.